Anyone who's navigated the back roads of rural Minnesota during a January storm understands precisely what I mean. The sky and highway merge into a seamless blanket of white. On that specific Monday, I was returning to Duth, following a visit with my mother in Baiji, a 3-hour journey I'd taken countless times since wrapping up nursing school 6 years prior. My 2018 graduating class often laughed about how we'd dispersed across the state like dandelion fluff, and I wound up pulling night shifts in the ICU at St. Luke's Hospital. The weather report had predicted only minor snow showers, nothing to deter a local who'd mastered slick rural lanes long before hitting voting age. I departed my mom's place shortly after 4 p.m., aiming to outpace the heaviest bands. Perhaps I'd stop for a bite at the cozy eatery just beyond McGregor before tackling the last leg. The Subaru Outback boasted solid tires, a topped-off tank, and I'd tackled harsher weather more often than I could recall. Gazing at the ashen clouds massing ahead, I figured this would unfold as yet another routine winter trek. By 5:30, regret hit hard. I'd misjudged badly. Those gentle flurries had escalated into a relentless assault. Torrents of snow lashed across Highway 2 at an angle, rendering my wipers pointless. I inched forward at around 20 miles per hour, fingers clenched on the steering wheel until my knuckles throbbed. My beams scarcely pierced the opaque veil ahead. Over the last half hour, traffic had vanished entirely. A clear sign I should have eased off and hunkered down. Yet the upcoming town lay just 15 miles distant, and I persuaded myself to press on, reasoning that halting on the roadside in such poor sightlines posed greater risk than continuing. That rationale holds up until your rear wheels skid on concealed black ice under a layer of new snow. The Subaru fishtailed sharply once or twice before veering broadside toward the roadside gully. The collision with the snowdrift jerked me violently ahead. Then silence fell, broken only by the gale buffeting the vehicle as if eager to capsize it. I lingered there, drawing steady breaths for what felt like ages. Running a swift personal check post-crash to confirm no damage, neck, spine, limbs, digits, all functional. No airbag trigger suggested the hit wasn't as severe as it seemed. Attempting to back away, the tires merely whirred futilely against the underlying frost. I toggled to drive, then reverse, jiggling the car as my dad had shown me at 16. But the awkward tilt trapped it firmly, offering zero grip. Fresh drifts mounted against the driver's door so rapidly that I tracked their climb through the glass, inch by inch. Snatching my phone from the console, panic gripped me at the blank display. No bars, not even a wavering one. This highway segment was infamous for signal blackouts, a fact I'd dismissed until it became critically relevant right then. The cabin chill deepened quickly, my exhales visible as faint mists. I left the motor idling for warmth, eyeing the gas dial and estimating survival time before conserving fuel. The tempest raged louder, blasts rattling the frame and whipping flakes into mesmerizing eddies beyond the panes. I waved the phone aloft, ceilingward, then window to window, hunting vainly for reception. My strategy: hold out for passing traffic, signal for assistance, secure a tow or lift to cell range. But no vehicles materialized. The route stayed deserted, devoured by the blizzard. each passing minute amplifying my sense of isolation in an icy abyss, far from rescue. I reminded myself to remain composed. This was Minnesota, after all. Help would arrive soon enough, as folks traversed this path regularly, storm or not. Patience was key. Almost 40 minutes elapsed before faint headlights appeared in the mirror, twin amber glows slicing the snowy shroud like the gaze of a lumbering beast. A surge of relief washed over me, shamefully intense, this rush of thanks for an unseen driver. As the vehicle neared, it eased to a stop, revealing the outline of an aging pickup with an extended cab and rust eating away at the wheel arches. It came to rest on the roadside roughly 20 feet back from my Subaru, its hazard lights flashing amber amid the swirling white. For a brief instant, everything remained still. In my rearview mirror, I saw the driver's door swing open, and a man stepped out, bent low against the gale, clad in a thick canvas coat, the shade of parched earth, and a hunter's cap with the ear flaps secured. He approached my vehicle at a leisurely stride that seemed odd in such fury. More like a casual saunter across a sunlit lot than a battle through a raging snowstorm on a forsaken stretch of road. I cracked my window down just 2 inches, sufficient for conversation, and the icy blast that poured in stung my skin like tiny pins. He bent toward the opening, giving me my initial clear glimpse of him. Perhaps in his mid-50s, his features bore the marks of years under open skies, deep lines etched around his eyes and a nose hinting at past fractures. His gaze held a faded blue, nearly colorless, scanning my features as if cataloging an object rather than engaging a person. He offered a grin, revealing teeth that appeared undersized for his jaw, and explained he'd spotted my skid off the road about a mile earlier, so he'd looped back to assist. His tone was steady and warm, carrying that distinctive Minnesota drawl that elongates vowels like pulled candy. He introduced himself as Lyle, inquired whether I was injured, whether help was en route. I assured him I was unharmed, merely mired, with no phone coverage, but confident another driver would pass by shortly. He gave a deliberate nod, scanning the barren highway in both directions before fixing those light eyes on me again. The wind screamed so fiercely that I had to edge nearer the slit to catch his words as he urged me to allow his aid in freeing the car before conditions deteriorated further, as if this weren't already the harshest storm I'd ever navigated. I expressed gratitude for his pause, yet insisted on awaiting a professional tow, noting my policy-covered roadside service and aid would arrive in time. My response stayed courteous and even-keeled, akin to soothing a relative in a tense medical scenario to keep tensions from rising. Lyle rose and studied my Subaru at length, then knelt back to the window with that narrow-toothed smirk intact. He pointed out no wrecker would brave this tempest, that officials had already shut down the route some 10 miles to the east, and I was fortunate he'd appeared when he did. The word fortunate landed oddly, sending a chill crawling under my layers. He grasped the door latch, tugging lightly at first, then harder upon discovering the lock. His expression held steady, but a shift flickered in his eyes like a ripple disturbing still water. He requested I release the lock so he could assist my escape, mentioning his rig's 4-wheel capability and tire chains. He could ferry me to shelter and heat. I declined firmly. Quote 1. Though my tone held firm, my pulse thrummed wildly in my neck. Lyle lingered there, it seemed like ages. A solid minute, peering through the narrow window slot, flakes building on his coat and hat edge. Then he circled to the rear of my car, vanishing from sight, prompting me to swivel and peer back, straining to discern his actions via the back glass. The flurry was impenetrable, the pain clouded by my exhales, yielding only his shadowy form near the rear wheel. A piercing hiss sliced the gale, and it dawned on me slowly. He was deflating my tire. Panic surged. I blared the horn in prolonged, frantic bursts that the blizzard devoured instantly. Lyle re-emerged at my side window. His face now etched with something beyond irritation, a resigned frustration, like a guardian facing an obstinate kid. He planted his boot at the door's lower edge, jamming it into the frame's seam, and pressed near the glass. His exhalations steamed the pain as he declared I had no option now but to take his aid. On a deflated wheel amid the whiteout, I wasn't moving. My resistance was unwise. He aimed to preserve my well-being. The deflate's whine persisted from behind, and it hit me. He'd shifted to the second rear tire prior to returning. I jabbed the horn relentlessly, its cries feeble and smothered by the tempest's fury. Lyle didn't so much as twitch. He just lingered there, his boot jammed against my door. Those lifeless eyes fixed on me as if time meant nothing to him. That's when I noticed it. A dim light flickering far off beyond his truck, peeking through the blizzard, unmistakable despite the haze. Another car, its beams inching our way, deliberate and unhurried. In that moment, I knew this was my shot to signal for help. I blasted the horn with all my might, yelling at the top of my lungs, fully aware that the sealed windows and raging gale would swallow any sound. Lyle swiveled his head toward the oncoming glow. For a brief instant, I dared to hope he'd back off, retreat to his vehicle, and vanish before witnesses arrived. But what he did next still jolts me awake on nights when the gusts batter my window. He lunged with surprising speed for someone his age, scaling the car's hood like a veteran at this grim task. In his grasp was a bundle he'd snatched from his truck earlier, out of my sight behind the vehicle, and he unfurled it while hunkering down like a hulking predator. It turned out to be a heavy green canvas tarp, the sort for shielding logs or concealing secrets. With swift, expert motions, he draped it over my windshield, securing the flaps along the sides to defy the storm's pull. Abruptly, total blackness engulfed me. The storm's muted pallor disappeared, giving way to an oppressive void that felt almost tangible against my face. The approaching engine's deep growl grew louder, thrumming in the air. I shrieked and hammered at the glass from within, desperate to shake the cover loose, to create any uproar that might alert the driver. Yet the tarp held firm, pinned by the fresh snow piling atop it. I caught the other vehicle easing to a halt, lingering briefly, then rolling onward. Its noise dissolved into the tempest, leaving only the wind and the scrape of Lyle's boots overhead. Methodical and unyielding, he bided his time in the shadow he'd imposed. A switch flipped in my mind, the raw drive to survive that surges when escape seems impossible. I quit the noise and blows, compelling myself to strategize. My purse sat on the seat beside me, holding a pepper spray canister my mom had handed me long ago. The kind of item you stash away and ignore until desperation demands it. In the pitch dark, I groped until my hand seized the chili tube. I cranked the window down a bit more, enough for my arm to slip out. Lyle was shifting above, likely angling to peer at the gap, and I sensed this was my single opportunity. As his features loomed in the slit, those washed-out eyes peering through, I triggered the spray straight into his face without a second thought. The noise he emitted was primal, a raw howl of fury and agony slicing the gale. He toppled rearward from the hood, crashing onto the snow by the passenger side, sputtering curses while scrubbing at his eyes. No time to check his state. I shoved my door wide, battling the drifted snow with a surge of power I never knew I possessed, and bolted. The tarp shrouded my view, tires deflated, signal non-existent. But those details faded from relevance. I dashed after the vanished car's path, plowing through waist-high drifts, the blast ripping at my jacket while strands whipped across my vision. From behind, Lyle's bellows pursued, hurling insults, warning I'd succumb to the cold, insisting I required him, that this was folly. Still, I pressed on. Roughly a quarter-mile along the road, lights pierced the flurry, not advancing, but fixed in place. Then it hit me. A farmhouse tucked off the highway, overlooked in the chaos. Somehow I reached their entrance, slumping against it, rapping frantically until an older woman swung it open, rifle at the ready, her spouse already dialing the authorities. They ushered me in, swaddled me in warmth, pressed steaming coffee into my trembling grip as shivers racked me. The deputy who showed up 40 minutes later reported they'd located my vehicle right where I'd abandoned it. Tarp intact, both tires punctured, but no trace of Lyle or his truck anywhere along that road. It happened in January 2023, nearly 2 years back. Authorities never tracked him down, not even verifying if a man like that resided in the area. Years later, the older pair, Frank and Margie Olson, shared with me that they'd picked up whispers over time about some guy in a brown pickup who prowled that section of road amid fierce storms, hunting for motorists stuck in the mess. They dismissed it as one of those old country tales folks spin to frighten kids into prepping their vehicles for the cold season. I often wonder what might have unfolded if my mom hadn't slipped that pepper spray into my bag, if it hadn't crossed my mind to grab it from there. If I'd popped the lock open the first time he requested it. I ponder that other vehicle that sped by as I yelled into the pitch black, how rescue hovered so near, yet I vanished entirely from view. These days, when I head to see my mom, I still take that route, but strictly during daylight hours. Only under sunny skies, and I always notify a friend of my departure time and expected arrival. Occasionally, as I cruise by the exact place where my vehicle plunged into the drift, I ease off the gas and scan the edge of the woods, almost anticipating the sight of an aged pickup rumbling idly amid the evergreens, biding its time for the next blizzard to hit. Folks know Minnesota's winters can be brutal, but no warning truly readies you for the moment a tempest reveals just how tiny and breakable you truly are. That harsh truth hit me on a Thursday in early December 2022, out on Highway 53 somewhere between Virginia and Eve, tiny spots in the Iron Range that outsiders rarely know unless they were raised there. At age 26, I'd spent nearly 2 years as an HVAC tech, piloting my work truck over icy rural roads to repair heating systems for families so remote that the closest market was a full hour's drive. The pay was solid, the isolation fit my personality, and I'd gotten used to those extended hauls across barren terrain. That familiarity nearly ended me. The weather report had noted possible snow, around 6 to 8 inches, standard stuff for northern Minnesota. But predictions can deceive, and this one did so in a manner that almost proved fatal. Trouble started when my windshield went utterly blank in under 30 seconds. Seconds earlier, the pavement was visible, along with the worn yellow stripes and bare branches framing the route. Then, everything vanished, engulfed by a dense curtain of flakes that seemed impenetrable. I eased to the shoulder right away, pulse racing, as the dash thermometer plunged from 12 degrees to -4 degrees in mere moments. My rig, a weathered Ford F-150 pieced together by 200,000 miles of corrosion and grit, began emitting an unfamiliar racket, a rasping, gasping wheeze that culminated in a jolt and then dead quiet. I twisted the ignition repeatedly, but the motor wouldn't budge. With it went the heat, and soon enough, in about 5 minutes, my exhales created dense fog inside the compartment. I sat frozen to the wheel, hands clenched, mentally figuring survival odds in a stalled vehicle during a whiteout, 0 phone bars, no traffic around. My cell showed a single wavering signal, pulsing like a fading pulse. I dialed 911 thrice, only for each attempt to cut off before linking up. I fired off a message to my supervisor, Hank, with my position and the fact I was immobilized. It lingered with a rotating icon for 10 minutes before marking as sent. No clue if it reached him. The chill was intensifying, the type that fumbles your grip and dulls your mind. Behind the seat, I kept a winter survival pack. Blankets, chemical warmers, a light, granola snacks, since Hank insisted on it for all rookies. I bundled up in the covers and activated a couple of warmers, tucking them close to my torso. For perhaps an hour, I convinced myself it was under control. A snowplow cop or fellow traveler would show up, yet the flakes piled relentlessly, obscuring even my own front end, and the outer hush was total. No motors, no chatter, just gales howling at the glass like an intruder probing for weakness. Stepping out of the truck ranks as my worst choice ever, and I recognized its folly in the act. But the creeping freeze messes with your head. It murmurs encouragements, insisting motion beats stagnation, that stirring equals staying alive. I recalled spotting a fuel stop about 2 miles earlier, a modest outpost with a weathered Conoco logo and one lonely pump. 2 miles. I'd covered more on foot before. Logically, it seemed sound. Trek there, reach shelter, summon aid over coffee and warmth. I layered everything available, my job coat, a sweatshirt beneath, dual gloves, wool cap tugged down tight. I snatched up the flashlight and a blanket, draping it over my shoulders like a superhero's cloak. As I swung open the truck door, a brutal gust slammed into me, almost knocking me off my feet. The chill had evolved beyond mere cold. It was an assault, a relentless power intent on ripping every bit of warmth from my core. Still, I forced myself out, slammed the door closed, and headed off in the direction I figured I'd come from. The initial 10 minutes weren't terrible. I hunched forward, tucking my chin against my chest, concentrating solely on advancing one boot after the other. Somewhere underfoot lay the road. I sensed the solid asphalt through the snow and let it steer me. Left boot, right boot, press on. Stick to the firm path. The blanket on my back was already drenched, weighed down by snow that thawed from my warmth only to refreeze into a rigid, icy crust. My flashlight pierced the swirling white with a feeble yellow glow, revealing just a few feet before the blizzard devoured it entirely. To distract my thoughts, I tallied my strides. 100, 200, 500. Around the 800 mark, I noticed I couldn't detect the road anymore. The terrain felt mushy and irregular now, and when I dragged my boot to the side, it struck something that snapped underfoot, perhaps a iced-over shrub or the brink of a gully. I halted, pivoted, and searched for the road once more. But it was gone. Everything was gone. Nothing but endless white stretching every way. So dense and bewildering that I lost all sense of direction, up from down, ahead from behind. That's when terror gripped me, sharp and overwhelming. I whirled around, swinging my flashlight wildly as if it might slice through the tempest and reveal my position. Useless. The gale had intensified, roaring fiercely enough to silence my racing mind. Snow lashed sideways now, pricking my cheeks like frozen shards. I chose a random path and pushed ahead, quicker this time, nearly jogging. My chest ached from the frigid air, every inhale like swallowing jagged shards. I lost track of how long I trudged on like that, floundering through drifts that reached my knees in spots, snagging on unseen obstacles. 10 minutes, 20, time blurred into irrelevance. Then, piercing the snowy veil before me, a light appeared, a dim yellow shimmer, pulsing faintly like a far-off flame. A wave of relief crashed over me, nearly dropping me to my knees. The gas station. I'd located it. I surged toward it with my last reserves. My thighs throbbed, fingers lifeless in their gloves, gaze fixed on that miraculous beacon. The light winked out. One instant it beckoned invitingly, the next it vanished into the storm as if it had been an illusion. I froze, eyes straining, willing it back. Perhaps the flurry had thickened briefly. Or I'd glanced away at the worst moment. I rotated gradually, peering into the blank void, and there it was again. But now off to my rear, in the path I'd just traversed. Impossible. I'd been heading straight for it. How had it shifted behind me? My mind scrambled for logic, insisting I'd twisted around unnoticed in the wind. I set off toward it once more, steps deliberate and measured. The freeze had burrowed into my marrow, shivering had ceased, and a faint corner of my brain, recalling those mandatory safety films from Hank, flagged it as dire. No more tremors meant my body was surrendering the fight to generate heat. Time was slipping away fast. I'm not sure exactly when the voice first registered. It seeped in gradually, like a signal emerging from interference. Initially, I dismissed it as the gale toying with my numb hearing, but soon it sharpened, a man's tone from my left summoning a name. Corbett, it called. Corbett. This way. That wasn't me. I'm Jensen. Yet in that haze, with my mind slogging through frozen sludge, doubt didn't surface. I veered toward the sound and kept going. It seemed utterly tangible, mere yards off amid the turmoil, as if a figure waited nearby in the whiteness. I even responded. "Hey!" I attempted to yell. It emerged hoarse and faint, scarcely above a murmur. "Hey! I'm right here! Over here!" The call persisted, always a touch further on, always elusive. "Corbett! Corbett! Come on!" I trailed it obediently, like a hound after its master, lurching through the powder with no sensation in my limbs or much of my face. Deep down, I sensed the anomaly. An inner voice wailed that no one was there, that isolation gripped me, that hypothermia was fraying my sanity. That voice was the last anchor I clung to, and I refused to release it. What followed is tough to describe since it didn't seem like it was unfolding in my reality. Instead, it was as if I hovered outside myself, observing from a short distance up in the air this staggering, ice-bound figure who had once been Jensen from Duth. The voice quit summoning Corbett and shifted to addressing me straight on, posing queries, sharing details, engaging in a complete dialogue as though we were longtime buddies reminiscing over drinks. I responded to it. I know that much because my throat ended up hoarse and parched from the effort. The bulk of our exchange escapes me now. Bits resurface in nightmares that snap me alert, drenched in perspiration. Snippets involving my father, gone since I was 19. Others concerning Melissa Hartman, the high school girlfriend I'd long forgotten. The voice possessed intimate knowledge of my life. Back then, it struck me as utterly ordinary. Naturally, it would know. Naturally, this phantom amid the gale recalled the day I smashed my bicycle into a mailbox at age 7, or the evening I sobbed alone in my pickup after Dad's burial, unable to weep before Mom. It all clicked together with the twisted logic of a dream, coherent until dawn shatters the illusion, exposing the falsehood. Eventually, a wave of warmth enveloped me, which defies belief under those conditions, but I recall it vividly, like entering a steam room. My coat turned oppressive, the sweatshirt beneath heavy as an overbound quilt. I had to shed them for some relief on my skin. My hands, numb and awkward as if borrowed from another, struggled with the jacket's fastener. Finally, I unzipped it, and bliss hit instantly, a blast of crisp air soothing my torso like paradise. I slipped the coat from my arms, letting it drop into the drifts behind. The throw had vanished earlier, discarded at some forgotten moment. Off came the sweatshirt, too, leaving me exposed in the storm wearing only a light plaid button-up. Yet I felt ideal, cozy, at ease, drowsy beyond measure. The voice lingered softer, more calming. It reminded me how I'd trudged for ages and earned a break. "Only a moment," it urged. "Rest here briefly, breathe easy, then press on." That seemed fair, precisely the reprieve I craved. I lowered myself into the powder, or perhaps toppled. By then, the divide between choice and mishap had dissolved. The surface yielded softly, chilling yet irrelevant now. No discomfort registered. I reclined, gazing at the pale expanse overhead as flakes drifted lazily toward me. They settled on my face, cheeks, brow, lids, and I didn't flinch. The voice murmured on, but the words dissolved into a murmur, a tender melody cradling me like fleece. My mind wandered to Mom, her anxiety mounting when I failed to return. To Hank, hoping he'd seen my message. To the roadside stop with its weathered Kiko emblem, so tantalizingly near, so certain a goal. My lids grew heavy. The snowy vista dimmed to ash. Then oblivion. My final thought a serene acceptance. No further steps, no biting chill, no burdens, only slumber, infinite and flawless, drawing me into a hushed, shadowy warmth. I came to in a Virginia medical center 3 days on, with frost damage afflicting 7 fingertips and my earlobes. A caregiver assured me survival was a miracle. The recovery crew had spotted me mere minutes post-collapse, tracking my trail from the vehicle. She phrased it casually, as if following a clear path across the white. Yet the responder who discovered me, Gentry, a fellow with gentle gaze and a dense gray beard, shared another tale. My tracks defied logic, he explained. They'd formed endless spirals, wide arcs repeating, etching odd designs in the drifts as if in ceremony. They recovered my coat and sweatshirt flung 30 feet from each other, the throw even more distant, as though I'd discarded fragments of my being en route. And here's what haunts his sleep still. Upon finding me sprawled in the frost, my mouth was active. I conversed with an invisible presence, animatedly debating with stiff iced fingers as if emphasizing a stance. He inquired about my interlocutor. I claimed amnesia. Untrue. I know precisely whom I addressed. I simply can't find the words to describe how the voice matched my father's perfectly, the one who'd passed away 7 years earlier, whispering that it was fine to let go and sleep, promising to remain by my side until I drifted off. The medical team explained that I'd lost the tips of my left hand's pinky and ring fingers right above the first joints. My ears mended over time, although the left one still goes numb during chilly weather and likely always will. I stayed in that hospital for 2 weeks, largely connected to devices that emitted beeps at regular intervals, which nearly sent me over the edge. My mother rushed up from Iowa the very next day after they discovered me and wouldn't budge from my bedside until release day. She shed plenty of tears, sparking my own, which only intensified hers. Hank stopped by on 2 occasions, delivering a card with signatures from the whole office crew, assuring me that my position remained secure for whenever I felt prepared to return. 3 months on, I resumed work. However, I steer clear of those remote deliveries these days. Instead, I base myself in Duth, repairing heating systems in residential towers and commercial hubs, spots where a gas station is just a quick 5-minute stroll away and cell signal holds steady. A few colleagues figure I've gone easy on myself. Perhaps that's true. It doesn't bother me. I've seen what's lurking in those desolate stretches when the frost strips away your illusions. That incident lingers in my thoughts far more than I'd prefer to confess. Occasionally, as sleep overtakes me in the evenings, the wind's wail pulls me back to that vast blank void, chasing an illusory glow guided by a voice that had no business existing. I consulted a counselor for some time regarding it. She explained the visions as a typical reaction to extreme cold exposure. My mind, she said, was powering down and dredging up recollections for comfort in the process. It's logical. That's the rational take. I accept it fully. Yet a quiet, persistent corner of my mind refuses to quiet down, pondering how a fading consciousness could replicate my dad's voice so precisely, down to the exact inflection when he uttered my name, the rhythm in his phrasing, the gentle undertone. The experts insisted I was isolated in the blizzard, wandering aimlessly and addressing thin air. They're undoubtedly correct. I have no doubt. But in the dead of night, with the home silent and icy gusts battering the panes, my certainty wavers. It fades entirely. No one prepares you for the eerie stillness that descends when you're genuinely stranded. Not the kind from gridlock or lingering for roadside help in a lot, but the sort amid utter isolation, with drifts accumulating around your vehicle and zero means to reach out. I keep mentally revisiting that evening, searching for alternate choices I might have made. The conclusion? Every single one. I'm Heather, and I hit 34 last spring, marking nearly 20 years navigating Michigan's harsh winters behind the wheel. Recklessness isn't my style, I don't take risks, and I always heed storm alerts. Still, on that January Saturday, I chained one poor judgment to the next. By the moment awareness hit of my dire error, correction was impossible. I was heading home from my cousin's wedding in Traverse City, a straightforward 2.5-hour trip. All I craved was my familiar mattress over shelling out another $150 for lodging. Things kicked off smoothly. The initial hour on Highway 131 featured merely damp roads and sporadic breezes swaying my Chevy Equinox. I'd monitored the forecast closely prior to departure, expecting a lull in the storm until about 10 o'clock. Flakes arrived ahead of schedule, near 8:30, escalating from gentle swirls to blinding fury in under 20 minutes. I eased off the accelerator, switched off the brights since they bounced right back, and fought to remain composed. When the navigation suggested a shortcut to bypass a collision ahead, I veered onto the ramp on impulse. The program promised nearly half an hour shaved off, and by then, haste was my sole focus. The path it directed me onto appeared solid initially, freshly cleared, flanked by snow-laden pines. I overlooked the shift from asphalt to loose stones, or how the ruts ahead grew fainter until they vanished. The device urged me onward in a straight line, so I pressed on. The route constricted, with accumulating powder undisturbed by salt trucks. My Equinox managed initially, thanks to all-wheel traction, though I crept along at about 15 miles per hour, gripping the wheel fiercely. I recall debating a reversal, but no safe spot presented itself. The lane was scarcely vehicle width, bordered by sheer drops concealed beneath the white blanket. I convinced myself a side path or broader area lay just beyond, allowing a turnaround maneuver to reclaim the main artery. The navigation unit indicated just 11 miles remaining on this stretch until it linked up with a different county path. 11 miles. No big deal. I could handle that. I kept chanting it in my mind like a mantra as the gale force winds screamed and flakes blasted horizontally into my beams. The bend caught me completely off guard. One instant, I was inching along, peering through the frosted glass, and the next, my front wheels bumped into something hidden beneath the drifts, perhaps a stone or an icy groove, and the vehicle lurched sharply rightward. I yanked the wheel too far the opposite way. The rear fishtailed wildly, and suddenly we were skidding uncontrollably. It all unfolded in a blur, too quick for even a gasp to escape. My Equinox veered off the pavement and tumbled into a modest gully, which I later figured was only about 6 or 7 feet down. The jolt wasn't brutal, more akin to settling into a massive drift. But attempting to back out, the tires merely whirred in vain. I shifted to drive, attempted to nudge it forward and back, yet I remained lodged. utterly, irretrievably trapped. I paused there for a solid minute, simply inhaling deeply, pulse thumping fiercely enough to sense it in my neck. Then I snatched my cell to summon aid and spotted the dreaded phrase that flipped my world. No service. I waved it about, lifted it toward the glass, even pried the door ajar to extend it into the icy blast. Zilch. Zero signal. Stranded deep in Michigan's countryside on a neglected back road, likely deserted for weeks, with no one aware of my location. I'd messaged my roommate from Traverse City announcing my departure, but skipped details on the side route. Fuel gauge hovered at a quarter, sufficient perhaps to keep the warmth going a bit if I skimped. The chill was plummeting rapidly outside, the gusts amplifying the bite. I killed the motor to stretch the gas and huddled in the pitch black, the tempest howling all around. The frame rattled and moaned under the relentless blasts from every direction. Drifts were already accumulating by the driver's panel. I glanced at the clock. 9:47. This promised an endless evening. Over the following hour, I alternated the ignition, blasting heat for 10 minutes before shutting it down for 20. I sipped sparingly from my flask and nibbled the energy bar I'd tossed into my bag from the event. I fiddled with my device constantly, yearning for a faint signal, but nada. By 11 o'clock, resignation crept in. I might need to endure till dawn for rescue. Fear gnawed at me, yet an odd serenity prevailed, as if my mind had concluded that frenzy served no purpose and simply locked it away. That's when the lights emerged. They flickered in my mirror initially, a pair of pale yellow rays piercing the flurry, roughly half a mile distant. I bolted upright, adrenaline surging anew. Another traveler on this forsaken lane, possibly with a working line or able to ferry me to civilization. I activated the flashers and blared the horn in quick taps every few beats, willing them to notice. The rig approached cautiously amid the powder, revealing itself as a hefty Ford F-150 extended cab model. It halted some 50 feet rearward, beams glaring, motor humming. I anticipated the operator emerging to assess, but silence. It merely idled on, stretching what seemed an eternity, likely just 2 or 3 minutes. Bewilderment overtook me more than anything. Why stay put? Perhaps dialing authorities or plotting the safest intervention. I pulsed the lights once more and leaned on the horn longer. No response. Gradually, it crept forward again, veering not alongside, but sideways, plowing through heavy accumulations until aligned athwart the route. The driver swung wide, positioning the F-150 to seal off all escape ahead or behind. At last, the door swung wide. Out came a figure, burly, towering, broad through the middle, clad in a shadowy jacket and a woolen beanie tugged down tight. His features blurred in shadow, the truck's glow casting him as a dark outline amid the blanketing white. He lingered briefly, eyeing my ride. Then he delved into the cab and extracted an item. It clicked after a beat, a lug wrench, the 4-pronged type for stubborn bolts. He gripped it casually in his dominant hand, wrapping it idly against his leg while advancing steadily. No haste, no sprint, just this measured stride, as though eternity was his. The hope those beams had sparked evaporated entirely. Replacing it, a icy dread twisting from my gut, seeping everywhere. All my gut feelings were yelling that this whole scenario was seriously off. I secured the doors without even thinking. It was pure instinct. That lock snapping into place echoed way too much in the car's hushed interior. The guy halted his approach the moment he caught the sound. He was roughly 20 feet off by then, near enough for me to spot the grin on his face. Not a warm, helpful kind of grin, like from someone ready to lend a hand in a pinch. No, it was the smirk of a person who knew they held every advantage while you were totally helpless. He muttered something, but the wind and the sealed window drowned it out entirely. He waved the tire iron toward my door, then mimed cranking the window down like he expected me to comply. I shook my head no. He edged in another step. My brain spun through every possible escape, drawing blanks. Getting away in the car wasn't an option since it was wedged tight. No phone signal meant no calling for aid, and sprinting from him through knee-high drifts in the dainty flats from the wedding? Forget it. The music soul barrier separating me from this stranger was a thin pane of glass and some flimsy body panels. And he wielded a tool built exactly for smashing stuff. He circled to the car's hood leisurely, eyeing the way it was mired in the ditch. Then he approached the driver's side and rapped on the window with the tire iron, 3 deliberate knocks that set the glass humming. He bent low, and that's when his features came into clear view. He seemed utterly ordinary. That hit hardest. No monstrous glare, no cinematic bad guy vibe, just an average dude, probably in his mid-40s, sporting an uneven beard and narrow black eyes. He might have been the guy next door, a colleague at work, or just another shopper you'd ignore at the supermarket. He spoke once more, and this time the words filtered through the barrier. He commented that I appeared chilly, offered to help me get comfortable. The tone sent chills racing across my skin. I snatched the nearest item, an ice scraper with a sturdy plastic grip, and brandished it where he could see. He chuckled outright, as if I'd cracked a hilarious one-liner. He lifted the tire iron higher, and I figured, that's it. He's about to shatter the glass and haul me out. I tensed up, plotting my swing with the scraper for when he lunged, but suddenly lights pierced the dark. Additional beams rolling in from the route his truck had taken. He noticed them as well, and his posture shifted instantly. He retreated from the window, glancing at the oncoming lights, then back my way. We locked eyes briefly, and I watched him sizing up his choices, deliberating. The fresh beams drew nearer, the rumble of a powerful engine growing audible. Maybe a second truck or an SUV. The guy gripped his tire iron, shot me one final glance, and in his gaze I spotted something more horrifying than the rest of that evening. Not rage or annoyance at the disruption, just calm assurance, like he was merely hitting pause on a plan he meant to resume down the line. He sauntered back to his vehicle unhurriedly, hopped inside, and vanished into the blizzard, his tail lights fading fast. The arriving rig turned out to be a local county snowplow on an urgent pass along the primary route a mile eastward. The operator, Pete, a fellow who seemed about 60, mentioned spotting tracks veering onto the access path and suspecting someone needed assistance. He radioed it in, and soon enough, a flatbed arrived to yank my Equinox from the gully while a sheriff's officer jotted down my account. I recounted it all, sketched the man's appearance, detailed his truck, even the snippet of the license plate I'd etched into memory amid the panic. They promised to investigate. It's been nearly a year since. No leads, no captures, zilch. I often ponder if he's still cruising those remote lanes in storms, hunting for another driver misled by their navigation. I offloaded the Equinox 2 months later. Riding in it felt unbearable after that. His face kept haunting the glass whenever I slid into the seat. These days, I stick to the interstate no matter what, even if it tacks on extra time. And when flakes begin to fly, I park it all together. I hunker down indoors, bolt the locks, and ride out the weather. February in northern Wisconsin has always been brutal, but I never imagined the horror lurking that Saturday night in 2024. My name is Connor Aldrich, and back then, I'd just finished a decade as a site supervisor for a construction outfit out of Ashland. My wife had departed 3 days prior to see her sister in Milwaukee, bringing our pup along, leaving me solo in the house as the blizzard alerts kicked off. My home was roughly 2 miles beyond the edge of the primary town, a simple ranch-style dwelling my grandfather constructed back in the 60s, encircled by endless white pines and utter quiet. The weather report predicted at least 18 inches of snow, with gusts reaching 50 miles per hour. Come late afternoon, I'd gathered plenty of firewood, topped off the bathtub for potential frozen pipes, and settled in for a couple of days filled with lousy TV and meals from cans. The flakes started drifting down near 4 p.m., soft and serene initially, before turning fierce and sideways as darkness fell. By 9 o'clock that night, the living room window offered just a faint glimpse of my mailbox's shape. And that thing was only about 30 feet away from the house. Howling winds tore through the trees like rumbling locomotives, and every so often I'd catch the sharp crack of limbs breaking in the black night, crushed by accumulating ice and drifts. The fire blazed steadily in the hearth, a Packers game murmured on the TV at low volume, and I cradled a half-empty beer that's gone lukewarm. The electricity had wavered a couple of times but stayed on, a minor blessing amid the fury outside. My cell displayed no signal, which wasn't surprising in this remote spot during rough weather when towers overloaded or failed. I felt thankful then for having no obligations, no need to brave that blinding blizzard. The solitude wrapped around me like a warm blanket, snug and reassuring, knowing I was secure indoors as the wild elements raged right outside. That illusion of security didn't hold for long. Around 10:15, the hammering began, not a polite rap, but forceful blows. 3 solid thumps on the front door that pierced the storm's roar and startled me into sloshing beer onto my shirt. At first I figured a limb had whipped against the siding, perhaps crashed into the frame with a gust. But it repeated, purposeful and steady, accompanied by faint voices, muffled, struggling against the shrieking winds, yet unmistakably people hailing from the porch. I silenced the TV and froze in the abrupt hush of the room, pulse racing, straining to process the sounds. No one had any business being outdoors in that tempest. Roads shut down at 7, per the county sheriff's radio alert, and my own quarter-mile gravel drive, untouched by plows, would have swallowed any ordinary car to its hubs. I snatched the baseball bat from beside the coat rack, an aging Louisville slugger from my high school years, and crept toward the entrance, hugging the wall away from the window. Peering through the frosted glass panel next to the door, I discerned two shapes on the porch, swathed in dark gear accented by vivid reflective bands on their shoulders and torsos. One pressed nearer to the door and yelled words lost in the gale, then delivered 3 more jolts that shook the whole panel. I switched on the outdoor light, which struggled to penetrate the whirling white frenzy beyond, and shouted to ask who was out there. A male voice replied firmly and urgently, claiming affiliation with emergency services and insisting on immediate evacuation. He mentioned dangers of building failures, citing a county-wide mandatory order for the zone, urging me to join them without delay. The woman next to him bobbed her head emphatically, her features obscured by a scarf, gesturing toward the shadowy area behind where their ride was likely waiting. The entire setup sent chills up my spine, even if I couldn't pinpoint the reason right then. I demanded they show ID at the window, and the man obliged, holding a plastic-wrapped card to the pane. The light illuminated it faintly enough for me to scan the header. Quote 5, along with a picture and a name too blurry to read. It seemed legit on the surface, but red flags popped up. No shiny hologram, no raised emblem, nothing like the real badges I'd spotted on county inspectors at our job sites. The image was askew, reproduced on plain stock and tucked into a basic sleeve from any stationery shop. Glancing beyond him to the supposed vehicle spot, I spotted just a vague form around 50 feet off. No emergency beacons, no official logos, merely what appeared to be an everyday truck with lights doused. Genuine response crews would have pulled up in labeled rigs with lights flashing wildly, particularly in such brutal conditions. True teams would have radioed warnings via alerts or arrived with law enforcement backup. Out of the blue, during the height of a fierce snowstorm, these two strangers showed up at my door sporting crudely made badges and driving an ordinary pickup. They insisted I had to abandon my cozy home right away. When I hesitated to let them in, the guy picked up his pace, his tone sharpening with irritation that felt more like annoyance than genuine worry for my well-being. He warned that the roof might give way at any second, mentioning how 3 nearby homes had already crumbled under the weight. And staying put was risking my life. The woman jumped in, explaining they'd established a heated refuge at the local community hall and urging me to head there without delay. There simply wasn't a moment to lose. I caught her repeatedly looking over her shoulder toward their shadowy vehicle, as if verifying something or keeping an eye on a companion. I thanked them for the alert, but assured them my place was sturdy, constructed decades ago to endure harsh Wisconsin winters for over 60 years. And I'd rather stay. His attitude shifted abruptly then, leaning in toward the entrance, so near that his exhale misted the pane. He dropped his voice and insisted they couldn't just abandon me, that they had instructions to evacuate everybody, and I should unlock it so they could detail the crisis properly. He emphasized orders in a way that suggested authority meant to cow or awe me. I clutched the baseball bat tighter and declared I wasn't budging. That's when the woman piped up once more, her words hitting me like an icy jolt unrelated to the freezing weather outside. She acknowledged my reluctance, noting how crises often spark fear, but stressed they only required brief entry to inspect the building's integrity up close. It would take no more than 5 minutes, she claimed, with thermal scanners in their truck capable of spotting foundation cracks, and they specifically wanted to examine the cellar. Her delivery was steady and reassuring, as if reciting lines from a well-rehearsed routine. The man agreed with a nod and even grasped the knob, twisting it gently to test. The bolt stayed firm. Bless that lock. But his boldness alone set my pulse racing wildly. I retreated a bit and yelled through the barrier that they'd better vacate my land at once or face a call to the authorities. He chuckled harshly, a brief, grating bark, and retorted that dialing out would be futile anyway, since lines were severed throughout the entire region and they represented the sole assistance for miles. He delivered it menacingly, underscoring my isolation in that remote spot. I withdrew to the kitchen, gaze fixed on the entryway, and lifted the wall-mounted corded phone. Nothing. No hum, exactly as he'd described. My mobile displayed 0 bars, the signal indicator barren. Dread swelled inside me, but I compelled steady breaths and clear-headedness, refusing to let terror dictate my moves. The knocks resumed, more forceful now, accompanied by his bellows about dwindling time, the intensifying gale, and my stubbornness. Amid his outbursts, snippets of their murmured conversation drifted in, too muffled to decipher. Soon after, boots crunched away from the steps, circling the perimeter through the drifts. They were scouting the grounds, peering at panes, hunting for vulnerabilities. I darted room to room downstairs, verifying all casements were fastened tight, all mechanisms engaged. In the utility area at the rear entrance, there she was, the woman, mere inches from the panel on the outer side, her gaze locking onto mine with a cold, unfeeling stare. She uttered no words, merely lingered, observing me across the iced-over surface as flakes danced around her like a pale veil. I recoiled, almost stumbling over some rugged footwear, steadying against the dryer. She cocked her head faintly, with a hint of intrigue, then extended a mittened finger to rap the glass thrice, methodical, unhurried, composed. From the front yard, the man's call echoed, inquiring about discoveries, but she ignored it, pivoting into the blizzard and vanishing. My fingers shook while I double-checked the utility latch, deemed it solid, then hauled a sturdy timber stool to barricade it further. Desperation clawed at me. I had to contact aid, connect with anybody, but all my channels were silent or ineffective. Suddenly, the vintage two-way radio downstairs sprang to mind, the relic my grandpa had wired in ages back for crises just like this. It had gathered dust for years without a single transmission. I wasn't even certain the old thing still functioned, but it drew power from its own battery and broadcast on wavelengths unrelated to cell networks or landlines. Snatching a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, I tiptoed down the basement steps, flinching at each groan from the worn wooden treads. The space below was chilly and pitch black, heavy with the scent of dust and aged cement, forcing me to weave around piles of stored boxes and discarded furnishings, until I reached the workbench holding the radio. The device appeared outdated, with its beige plastic casing and metallic knobs. Yet as soon as I toggled the switch, a faint red indicator glowed to life, filling me with overwhelming gratitude. Grasping the microphone, I scanned the frequencies, broadcasting my plea to anyone listening, giving my name, location, and warning of trespassers on the premises, acting as if I were official responders. The first 3 bands offered only crackles, followed by the same on the next 2. It wasn't until Channel 9 that a woman's voice broke through the interference. She requested I restate my position. I repeated the address and rushed through the details on the intrusion. Music. A pair posing as local responders with bogus IDs, no official car, attempting to break inside. Silence followed briefly. Then she informed me she was connecting me to Bayfield County Emergency Dispatch. What seemed like forever later, a male operator joined and prompted me to outline the events. Once I wrapped up, he fell silent for an extended beat before responding. No rescue units had been sent out across the county that evening, he explained. All official staff remained sidelined because of the tempest's intensity. Anyone at my doorstep, he clarified, had no ties to any legitimate authority he recognized. He instructed me to remain connected, secure the entrances, and promised to summon a deputy to my site once the paths were passable, though that might take hours, music, or more, based on the weather's fury. Inquiring about armaments at hand, I mentioned the baseball bat and the firearm my dad had bequeathed, still secured in an upper-level cupboard. He urged me to fetch the gun, chamber a round, music, and signaled to potential intruders that I was equipped and ready to protect my home. Though calm, his tone carried an edge of insistence, conveying I was isolated for the moment and the peril was real. I expressed thanks, placed the mic aside on the bench, music, keeping the line active, and ascended the stairs with as little noise as possible. Darkness enveloped the house more completely now. The electricity had failed during my descent, leaving me to grope through the beam of my light amid rooms that now seemed alien and threatening. From the upstairs storage, I extracted the rifle, fumbling to load it with trembling fingers, music, before slipping down to the front area. Peering out the window, I spotted the duo in the driveway, huddled by their vehicle, their forms dimly outlined against the swirling flakes. They appeared locked in dispute, motioning at the building, the path, and one another. In that instant, I chose a risky but essential course. Flipping on the exterior lamp, I unlatched and cracked open the entryway, positioning myself in view with the weapon aimed squarely at them. Yelling against the gale, I declared I'd reached the county law enforcement, that officers were en route and any advance onto my land would end with gunfire. The fellow edged forward, prompting me to rack the slide with a sharp report that pierced the gale like lightning. He halted abruptly. His companion clutched his sleeve, drawing him away while uttering words lost to the roar. Tension hung for what felt like ages, with no one stirring. At last, wordlessly, they pivoted and returned to the truck. The motor roared to life, beams cut through the night, and they reversed along the drive until the rear lights vanished into the snowy abyss. I lingered on the threshold another 5 minutes, gun at the ready, music staring at the vacant spot they'd occupied, then retreated within and bolted the door. Tremors racked me entirely, not from the chill, but from the pent-up rush with nowhere to release. The deputy didn't show until nearly 6 a.m., once the gale's peak had subsided and crews had shoveled the primary routes. He went by Russell Engel, a sturdy fellow in his 50s, sporting a silver mustache and weary gaze, hinting at a night of non-stop crises. I pointed out the tracks encircling the property, despite the drifts mostly obscuring them, and recounted the ordeal with every detail I could summon. He jotted down details without cutting in, giving nods now and then, his face turning more somber as my account unfolded. Once I wrapped up, he revealed that mine wasn't the only report he'd fielded that evening. A couple of other residences in remote corners of the county had faced comparable run-ins. Outsiders posing as crisis responders, music demanding folks clear out right away, turning hostile when denied access. In one case, an older lady had let them in, music, and when a neighbor stopped by the following day, her place was ransacked of anything worthwhile, with her discovered shut in her basement, parched yet unharmed. The deputy mentioned they were teaming up with state troopers to track down the culprits, noting how the phony credentials and the truck lined up with reports from those other episodes, though no one was in custody yet. He handed me his business card and urged me to reach out if more details surfaced or if those intruders returned. They never showed up again, not at my place anyway. 6 weeks on, a story in the local news caught my eye about music, a duo nabbed for a spate of break-ins aimed at countryside dwellings amid brutal weather. Their routine stayed consistent. Bide time for a fierce tempest, sever lines if feasible, arrive decked out in bogus rescue attire, and persuade occupants to abandon their unguarded spots. When homeowners pushed back, the pair would shift to softer marks, though they'd ramp up the pressure at times. The piece blurred their identities, but described a guy and gal in their upper 30s, each with records of larceny and scams. I couldn't confirm beyond doubt if they were the same couple who'd lingered on my doorstep that evening, yet I'm convinced it was them. My spouse returned home 2 days post-storm, and I laid it all out for her, music leading her to avoid solitary nights in the house for months to come. That spring, we set up an alarm setup, fitted motion-activated floods across the whole lot, and I showed her the ropes on the CB for emergencies. These days, whenever a massive squall hits, I double and triple check the deadbolts, strain for boot steps on the veranda, scan the approach for uninvited beams. I recognize keeping that door barred was the smart call. Still, on certain evenings, I toss in bed pondering the alternate path. If I'd swung it wide, their next moves, my final whereabouts. The gale beyond fades in time, but that nagging query lingers on. My grandma bequeathed me 40 acres of cropland beyond Bozeman, Montana, upon her death that spring of 2017. At age 26, snagging a farmhouse felt superior to shelling out for an apartment in Portland, my home base since college days. Plenty of buddies figured I'd gone off the rails, heading solo to a spot where the next house lay 3 miles along a gravel path and the nearest market meant a 40-minute haul. Yet the quiet drew me in. Music, that genuine blackness of night out there, free from the amber haze of urban lamps seeping past drapes. I'd settled on the land for roughly 8 months when the deep freeze hit hard. I figured I'd grasped the essence of remoteness then. I was mistaken. True solitude dawns when a snowstorm wipes out every known feature. When the path dissolves, barriers fade, and your home stands as the sole entity, music, amid infinite pale nothingness. That day, the alert device had been blaring alerts on the approaching front since daybreak. Come midday, flakes tumbled in heavy sheets, slashing sight lines to perhaps 20 feet. I'd covered all bases, crammed shelves with preserves, topped off the generator's tank, hauled in surplus logs, juiced up my cell completely. The structure was sturdy, erected by my great-grandpa in 1952, boasting hefty barriers to dull the gusts and a fireplace capable of warming the whole ground level. Near 3 p.m., I lingered by the kitchen pane, observing the landscape dissolve, savoring that quiet confidence of readiness as the elements battered the exterior. The gale roared fiercely enough to rumble through my torso. That's likely why the initial cries escaped me, why the man's wails needed to pierce the tempest's roar before registering. A noise so raw and pleading, music, it sliced through the turmoil beyond. At first I dismissed it as hallucination. In such profound hush, alone, the mind conjures noises to combat the void. But it repeated, more insistent. A fellow in torment, somewhere near the dwelling. I snatched the torch from the counter cabinet and approached the entry, leaning my head to the chilled timber. Music. The cries persisted, hoarse and tormented, right there on the stoop. My pulse raced wildly as I unlocked the deadbolt and eased the door ajar, directing the flashlight's glow into the whirling blizzard. There he lay, collapsed on my porch steps like a marionette abandoned by its puppeteer. He wore a brown canvas coat over jeans, gripping his right leg, while wincing up at me past the frost, rimming his brows and beard. He appeared around 40 or 45, his features roughened by years, with light blue eyes narrowing in the beam's glare. Tremors racked his body, and the blue hue creeping into his lips filled me with dread like nothing else. He introduced himself as Ray, explaining he'd been navigating the county road until the blizzard intensified, forcing him to stop and ride it out. He'd set out on foot seeking aid once his vehicle's warmth began to fade, but he'd skidded on a slick spot roughly 100 yards from my drive, hearing a crack in his ankle. He dragged himself the remaining distance, guided by the dim shine of my porch lamp amid the gale. His words emerged in ragged breaths amid the chills. Despite a nagging instinct urging caution, I couldn't abandon him to perish in the freeze right outside. I hooked my arms beneath his and hauled him into the entryway, his hurt leg dragging as he yelped in agony. The chill he brought rushed in fiercely, nipping at my bare skin, and I shouldered the door closed against the tempest, while he sprawled on the tiles, moaning and murmuring thanks repeatedly. I dialed 911 right away, my fingers fumbling over the display. The operator confirmed the obvious. Roads blocked solid, rescue teams overwhelmed county-wide. Help would arrive once feasible, though that might take hours or more. She urged me to warm him, raise the damaged limb, monitor for advanced frost damage. After ending the call, Ray gazed at me from the floor with those icy blue eyes, offering a smile intended as appreciation, but striking me as oddly off, indefinable. I assisted his limping progress to the sitting room, his arm draped across my shoulders, his bulk leaning into me as he flinched at each step. I positioned him on the sofa by the fireplace, tucking around him the thick wool throw my grandma once left on the easy chair, then headed to the kitchen for some brew. That's when the initial inconsistency hit me. Peering from the kitchen pane, I viewed the porch edge and a slice of the lawn ahead. The view had cleared a bit with the gusts veering. I scanned the area where Ray insisted he'd inched up the stairs, anticipating traces. A rumpled track in the drifts, imprints from dragging limbs. Yet the steps' snow appeared pristine, barely marred save for our entry scuffle. I rationalized that the squall had blanketed his path in the interim since he'd shown up. But the timing didn't align. He'd been audible in distress for several minutes prior to my opening up, and the porch roof shielded the stairs. Fresh powder couldn't have built up so swiftly. I fixed on the flawless blanket and sensed an icy dread twisting in my gut, unrelated to the outdoor bite. I delivered the mug and claimed the seat opposite on the armchair, observing as he clasped it between his palms. He sipped leisurely, his gaze sweeping the space with unsettling intent, appraising corners, exits, and panes before returning to mine. He inquired how long I'd resided here by myself, and I fibbed on impulse, claiming my partner was dozing off a bug upstairs. Ray inclined his head, though a subtle twitch in his face suggested disbelief. He probed whether the upper-level rooms had door bolts. He claimed mere curiosity, not wishing to overstep, just ensuring my comfort with an unknown presence. The probe felt amiss, overly pointed toward safeguards. I admitted the upstairs portals were antiquated, locks long unreliable. A fact, yet one I regretted voicing instantly. He dipped his chin once more deliberately, and savored another pull from his cup. His ankle, the supposedly fractured one, lounged on the pillow I'd elevated for it. But it struck me I'd witnessed no puffiness, no discoloration, solely his assertion of harm. I slipped away under pretense of inspecting the power unit, a fabrication, to gain a brief respite and collect my thoughts. It sat in the entry, where I loitered feigning inspection as my brain replayed the sequence of events. I doubted his tale about the vehicle on the county road. No engine noise, no headlights cutting through the gale before he showed up. Those absent drag marks on the porch stairs, the manner in which he inquired about the locks, about rooms fastened from within. I slipped my phone from my pocket and redialed 911, my tone hushed. The operator picked up once more, and I posed the question as nonchalantly as possible. Had there been reports of a ditched car on the county road close to my place? She looked it up and confirmed nothing. No such reports. 0 reports of motorists in distress around here. I expressed thanks and mentioned I'd ring again if things changed. Then I ended the call and leaned against the mudroom wall. My breathing grew short and rapid. Either Rye had fabricated the car story, or he'd misrepresented the route he'd taken, or he'd been untruthful about it all. I returned to the living room and spotted him by the window, feet planted firmly, gaze fixed on the tempest outside. He pivoted at my approach, and briefly, His features betrayed an indescribable look, vacant, yet assessing, akin to someone weighing chances. Then the facade returned. The wince of pain, the subtle stoop as he eased off his alleged sprained ankle. He claimed to have caught a sound outdoors, perhaps some creature. I urged him to resume his seat, insisting he avoid weight on that foot, and observed his exaggerated hobble toward the sofa. But I'd glimpsed the truth, the fluid, even gait when he assumed I wasn't watching, unmarred by any wound. My grandma stashed a shotgun in the hall closet, empty but with ammo on the upper shelf tucked behind dusty picture books. I'd never shot it, scarcely handled it right, yet its presence offered a psychological anchor. I settled into the armchair again, phone clutched in my grip, feigning interest in my screen while sidelong glances tracked Ray. He launched into further queries, seemingly offhand, but sharply targeted beneath. Distance to the closest neighbor? Did the county clear my road during snow, or did I rely on a private service? Any relatives in the vicinity who stopped by amid bad weather? Each probe exposed another facet of my isolation, charting my weak spots with the expertise of a practiced intruder. I responded evasively, exaggerating the proximity of neighbors, conjuring a sibling in town who dropped in regularly. Rye acknowledged with nods, though his stare had sharpened, abandoning much of the charade of a thankful, hurt outsider. The gusts outside intensified, shaking the panes. Then, faintly amid the roar, a noise froze me solid. It was the barn door banging ajar and closed by the blasts, but I'd fastened it tight myself pre-storm with a padlock since the basic catch couldn't withstand fierce winds. Another person had tampered with it. Ray noticed as well. His head snapped toward the racket, and momentarily his poise faltered, a glimmer of eagerness, almost excitement, before he reined it in. He wondered aloud about the commotion, voice still feigning polite curiosity, but laced with barely concealed thrill. I dismissed it as mere weather. Old structures groan in gales, I said, though my pulse hammered so fiercely I feared he'd detect it. Rising deliberately, I announced I needed to inspect something and headed to the hall in steady strides, resisting the urge to bolt. The closet lay just 10 feet off. I sensed Ray's gaze boring into me, monitoring every shift, and I knew instinctively that grabbing the gun would shatter his pretense. Instead, I bypassed the closet, proceeded to the bathroom, and secured the door. I cranked the tap to mask my words and phoned 911 anew, murmuring urgently that aid was critical. The guy inside wasn't hurt, and I suspected another presence outdoors. The dispatcher held the connection, explaining a sheriff's deputy was already dispatched from my prior report, my repeated calls flagging my location for urgency. She instructed me to remain put, bar the door, avoid contact with him. From the living room came Ray's movements, footfalls confident and leisurely. No hint of a stagger. Then, the bathroom knob twisted, a methodical effort halted by the bolt. He uttered no words. He lingered just beyond the barrier. And I held my position on this side, phone to ear, water rushing, the pair of us in tense suspense. That moment dragged on endlessly, heavy and oppressive, until at last a fresh noise pierced the gale. A motor. Beams from headlights swept over the icy bathroom pane. Crimson and azure lights pulsed through the frost, and Ray's steps hurried away toward the rear of the home. The mudroom entrance banged wide, letting in a fierce gust of wind. Then the operator informed me the sheriffs were right at the front entrance. My hands shook as I ushered them inside. Two lawmen blanketed in snow, cheeks flushed from the chill. I blurted out the entire tale in a rush: the stranger, his phony wound, the inquiries about security, the stable entrance. One remained by my side as the other pursued Ray, vanishing into the swirling blizzard beyond the house, his light slicing through the flurry. They nabbed him roughly 200 yards away, heading for the tree line. He moved without issue, sprinting even, until the sheriff brought him down into a bank of snow. When they hauled him back restrained, his expression had shifted utterly. Gone was the warm appreciation, the hurt outsider. No trace left, only icy vacant fury. The glare of a scheme unraveling. The sheriff beside me requested a look at his ankle, but Ray fixed him with an unblinking stare, offering no reply. His limb showed no damage whatsoever, no fracture, no twist, nothing at all. He'd dragged himself to my veranda and staged the injury from start to finish. Every grimace, every whimper, every thankful grin, pure performance, all aimed at breaching my home. Yet that wasn't the most chilling discovery. As the tempest started to subside near midnight, one sheriff patrolled the grounds with a bright search beam. He spotted tracks looping around the stable, recent enough that the drifts hadn't buried them yet. Another pair of prints, narrower than Ray's footwear, trailing from the stable to the house's rear before veering into the open land as the cruiser lights flared. Another figure had lurked out there all along, hidden in shadows, peering at my panes. The sheriff mentioned the stable gate ajar, its lock sheared neatly by clippers. Within, etched on the timber panel near the threshold, two phrases that haunt my dreams to this day. She's alone. They never apprehended the other individual. Ray stayed silent, offered a bogus identity that dead-ended, and wound up incarcerated for unlawful entry and tried theft, even though all who knew the details understood it could have escalated far beyond mere robbery. I offloaded the property after 3 months, relocated to Portland, and for the following year, I slumbered with all lamps blazing and a seat jammed against my sleeping quarters frame. Even now, I jolt awake around 3 a.m., pulse racing, convinced of a groan beyond my glass. And I ponder if the escaped one still prowls out there, biding time for the next squall, the next remote homestead, the next compassionate soul willing to unlock her barrier. Clashes with my stepfather always turned ugly, but that evening stood apart. He'd been at the bottle since mid-afternoon. When he launched into his rant about me squandering my days at a storage facility rather than pursuing higher education, I snapped. Harsh words flew, a light fixture toppled, and my mother simply wept on the sidelines instead of intervening. I'd hit 26 the prior November, mature enough to recognize the folly of storming into a blizzard, yet immature enough to commit that precise idiotic choice. A February in central New York pays no heed to emotions, and the flakes had whipped horizontally since noon. I snatched my jacket from the peg, jammed my worn shoes on, and banged the exit shut. The village lay just 2 miles along Garrison Road. My plan was to reach the cafe, grab a mug of Joe, and ring my pal Ray for a lift once I'd cooled off. Quarter hour into the trek, I realized my grave error. The snow removers had quit hours earlier, and the powder already topped my ankles, seeping into my pants and icing my flesh. My toes had gone senseless, fingers prickling despite being buried in my jacket. The lamps lining the path stood pitch black, likely felled by snapped cables higher up the slope. No vehicles had passed, no glows pierced the dark since departing home. The world was a blur of ivory and slate, hushed save for the gusts slicing my layers. I assured myself the fuel stop by the aged span was perhaps half a mile off, where I could thaw and plod ahead. That's when the noise reached me from the rear. A motor growling deeply and deliberately, wheels churning the drifts at a speed mirroring my stride. I peered over my shoulder and caught sight of beams parting the veil, perhaps 30 feet back. A shadowy truck, inching forward. My initial reaction was gratitude, perhaps a good Samaritan offering a lift to the settlement. The pickup kept maintaining that sluggish crawl, neither accelerating nor decelerating, as if it were deliberately tailing me. I glanced back once more and quickened my stride a bit. I could have sworn the motor revved up just enough to match my speed. My pulse began racing, unrelated to the biting chill. I tried convincing myself it was all in my head, that the driver likely had poor visibility in the blizzard and was just proceeding cautiously. Yet deep down, instinct warned me differently. The vehicle lingered close behind, refusing to overtake without a single blast of the horn or any typical reaction, simply shadowing me. Roughly 2 minutes into this eerie pursuit, a brief honk sounded, and the truck eased up alongside, the passenger side window descending with an electric hum. The driver shifted toward the lowered glass, giving me my initial glimpse of him. He looked around 50, burly build, sporting a dense gray beard and a camo hunting hat tugged down over his brow. The interior light illuminated the cab, revealing scattered fast food debris on the dash and a jumble of items cluttering the rear seat. He flashed a grin my way, but it seemed forced, lacking any genuine warmth, like an act rather than sincerity. He inquired what on earth I was doing trudging through such foul conditions. He warned that I'd surely succumb to hypothermia if I continued on foot. His tone stayed even, excessively composed, as though he'd scripted the words. I assured him I was okay, that the town lay just ahead. He wagged his head dismissively, claiming the path forward was utterly obstructed and that I'd never reach it walking. He urged me to hop in, promising to drop me off anywhere I wished. The wipers thrashed rhythmically against the glass, and the rush of warm air from the cracked window was a tantalizing relief on my numb cheeks. A strong urge tugged at me to just pile in for some relief from the freeze. To my enduring remorse, that's the choice I made. I circled to the front of the rig, momentarily dazzled by the beams, then slid into the front passenger spot. The blast of warmth inside stung sharply against my chilled flesh, and I cupped my palms to the vents as if they were my sole lifeline. The guy introduced himself as Chad and inquired about my name. I shared it, and he echoed it back deliberately, savoring the sound. He shifted into gear and pulled away, at which point I mentioned I only needed a lift to the central drag in town. The diner would do. He dipped his chin in agreement, murmuring, "Yeah, sure thing." Yet at the upcoming junction, he veered left rather than continuing straight. I'd known these routes forever, and that direction led away from civilization, plunging into vast expanses of fields and forest that went on endlessly. I questioned his route, forcing my voice to remain level. He explained the primary route was jammed by a overturned big rig, insisting he knew a shortcut. With no means to verify, my cell showed no bars, and the gale intensified relentlessly. Chad began probing with queries that initially felt innocuous. Where was my home? What line of work was I in? Any spouse? I replied curtly, eyes fixed on the path ahead, mentally mapping our position. But soon the inquiries turned odd. Did I reside by myself? Had anyone been informed of my nighttime stroll? Would relatives fret over my absence? When I affirmed the latter, he fell silent for an extended beat before remarking it was positive. Family ought to look out for one another. His phrasing sent chills racing across my skin, despite the toasty interior. I caught him stealing repeated peeks my way, not at the windshield, brief, assessing sidelong stares. The truck inched along at perhaps 20 miles per hour through the drifts. Suddenly it hit me. I had no clue how much time had passed. 10 minutes? 15. At most. We'd passed no familiar markers by now, no farmhouse, silo, or intersection, I recalled. Beyond the windows stretched only swirling void and unfamiliar woodland. I forced composure, strategizing. My door latch was free. I'd confirmed that upon entry, but bailing from a rolling truck amid the whiteout, disoriented in nowhere, felt like swapping perils. Chad had lapsed into stillness, which unnerved me more than his interrogation. He murmured a wordless tune softly, looping the same motif over and over. Details I'd overlooked earlier sharpened into focus. A loop of heavy yellow rope coiled at my seat's base, suited for securing gear, a partial roll of silver duct tape in the console's holder, a flashlight crammed beside his cushion and the divider. Individually, nothing alarming, I reasoned. Folks stash all sorts in their vehicles. Still, my nerves fired on instinct, muscles coiling, breaths turning quick and tight. I pressed him once more on the distance left, and he replied, "Almost there. Couple miles tops." Then he extended a hand to tap my knee lightly, twice, and I barely restrained a recoil. His palm felt weighty and toasty against my damp jeans, lingering a moment longer than necessary before he withdrew it. The pickup veered onto a tighter path, with no tire marks visible in front of us whatsoever. We were pioneering this route since the blizzard began. Music far from any major highway. Dense foliage crowded the edges, limbs rasping along the vehicle's sides like insistent claws seeking entry. Chad inquired whether I had a partner, and as I hesitated, he emitted a deep, rumbling laugh, claiming he was merely chatting. He remarked music that enduring a tempest like this alone must be isolating, emphasizing how folks ought to watch one another's backs. My fingers clenched the door grip until my knuckles throbbed, as I mentally gauged whether I'd endure tumbling into the drifts at our current pace. Suddenly, it appeared in the distance, a dim radiance filtering through the woods, illuminated windows from some structure with electricity. Chad noticed it as well, and I observed his jaw clench briefly before easing. He suggested we pause there briefly if I wished, allowing the weather to subside somewhat. I agreed without delay, striving to mask my urgency. It turned out to be a modest fueling stop, the sort of outdated standalone outfit featuring a pair of pumps and an adjoining mini-mart. Interior bulbs glowed, and through the misted pane, I spotted a figure shifting behind the register. Chad eased the truck beside the pumps, yet kept the motor humming. He offered to stay put, urging me to head inside, thaw out briefly, and use the facilities if required. His tone implied he anticipated my prompt return. I acknowledged with a nod, swung the door wide, and the frigid air slammed into me after the cozy interior. I approached the shop's doorway, compelling myself to stroll rather than sprint, avoiding any backward glance. His gaze bored into me throughout. The entry chime tinkled as I entered, greeted by cozy air scented with brewed coffee and rotating frankfurters on the heated spits. An elderly woman, around 60, manned the counter, her spectacles perched atop silver tresses. She glanced my way, and her features shifted upon noting my expression. Evidently, my fear was palpable, prompting her instant query about my well-being. I blurted that I required assistance, explaining the fellow outside had given me a lift, and I felt endangered. The confession spilled forth hurriedly, my tone breaking. Without pause or doubt, she didn't probe my certainty or dismiss my concerns. Instead, she fetched a wireless handset from beneath the till, gestured toward a portal past the snack racks, and instructed me to retreat there and remain. I caught her lifting the receiver to call. The rear space was a cramped cubicle, a cluttered desk strewn with documents and a seat with a torn pad. A narrow pane sat high on the wall, and peering out, I viewed the truck idling outside, motor purring, music vapor, curling pale amid the flurry. Chad wasn't facing the building, his attention fixed on an item in his lap, perhaps his cell. I huddled in that chilly nook, trembling beyond the chill, fixated on the vehicle, silently begging he wouldn't enter searching. 5 minutes elapsed, then 10. She appeared at the threshold, informing me she'd summoned the authorities, help en route despite potential delays from the conditions. She offered coffee, and her gentleness nearly brought tears. I continued monitoring via that slit. Chad lingered in his cab endlessly, it seemed, motor droning, blades sweeping. Roughly quarter hour later, the dome light flickered on. Now he eyed the storefront music, and despite the range and flakes, his displeasure was evident. He glowered at the edifice for another couple minutes, prompting me to withdraw from the view, though I doubted his visibility. Then the stop lamps blinked. He shifted to reverse and departed the premises. I tracked those crimson rears fading into the blankness until gone. My knees buckled, dropping me onto the worn seat. That's when the sobs finally escaped. The lawman's aide showed up some 40 minutes afterward, a fellow named Whelan, still youthful, who recorded my account and personally ferried me home. He assured they'd investigate, seeking a matching rig. I recounted every recollection: the camo cap, the silver stubble, the litter of takeout refuse, the golden cord, everything. He acknowledged, jotting notes, yet his demeanor conveyed skepticism. A shadowy truck in backcountry New York during winter, that described countless locals. To my knowledge, they never located him. I rang the station several times in the ensuing month, but updates were nil. No clues, no matching incidents. Zilch. I often question whether Cadet was truly his given name. That evening haunts my thoughts far more than it ought to, particularly during snowy spells. I ponder what might have unfolded if the gas station's electricity had failed, just like the rest of the area. Without those lights piercing the trees, everything could have turned out differently. I reflect on the path I was following that night, and deep down, I sense I was never supposed to arrive at its destination. The clerk there, Beverly, received a proper thank you from me a week afterward. She assured me I'd made the wise choice by heeding my gut, explaining how so many folks dismiss that inner warning when danger looms. I've paid attention to it ever since. By the time I arrived at the cabin, snow was already accumulating around the porch stairs, and the entire structure seemed engulfed by the season's chill. My job had worn me down that winter, so a break seemed long past due. The notion of an isolated getaway hidden among the pines appealed greatly. The place was roughly 20 minutes from a quaint Colorado mountain village, complete with a single primary road and a diner locals hailed as a landmark. The quiet struck me as unusually profound, as though the snowfall had compressed the landscape into subdued stillness. As I lugged my luggage from the truck, I noticed the initial tracks in the snow, recent ones, with sharp outlines intact, tracing an erratic route around the property. Initially, I assumed the landlord might have visited shortly before, yet the prints overlaid the fresh layer from earlier that day, which puzzled me. The image stuck in my mind even after I opened the door and entered. The interior carried the air of frequent rentals, eclectic furnishings, and a subtle aroma of aged logs, though it offered sufficient coziness. After dropping my gear and scanning the space, certain subtle elements caught my attention and unsettled me. A wooden seat positioned several paces from the dining area faced the window, as if an occupant had been observing the outdoors. Nearby on the floor, a partially consumed match lay abandoned, suggesting carelessness on someone's part, while 2 cans of soup from the listed stock were absent from the cupboard. Nothing overt, but the particulars sowed doubt about the apparent vacancy. I reasoned that a recent visitor had likely taken temporary refuge, common in such secluded areas, and departed when alerts about the weather hit. Yet the atmosphere implied it hadn't stood empty for any extended period. The blizzard intensified rapidly outside, battering flakes against the panes until the woods blurred into vague silhouettes. Cut off from cell service with the closest house a half-mile away, attempting to unwind felt akin to being trapped in an airtight container. To ease my anxiety, I inspected each space. All seemed ordinary, save for the upstairs hallway's final door, which steadfastly resisted opening. It lacked a standard lock, no key slot or handle mechanism, simply immovable, like an obstruction from within, held it firm. Pressing my ear to the panel yielded silence, and I chalked it up to the frame expanding in the frost, though that rationale rang hollow. Recent use was evident, streaks on the surface and subtle impressions by the grip. As night deepened, the gale devoured the typical rustles from the timberline. I prepared a basic meal, attempted to lose myself in reading, and repeatedly assured my mind that the shelter was secure. Gusts shook the exterior panels and howled through minute cracks by the glass. For a time, those disturbances accounted for any oddities. But nearing midnight, as tension began to ebb slightly, a gentle creak echoed from above. This wasn't mere house settling. It carried intent, a rhythmic tread, reminiscent of a person adjusting stance on creaky boards. Frozen in place, I fixed my gaze upward, timing the intervals between each subdued wood protest. Periodically, another emerged, subtle, purposeful. The barricaded chamber, the tracks, the traces of meals and lounging, they wove into a disturbing web, transforming the isolation into unwelcome company. The cabin no longer seemed deserted, it felt tenanted. The subsequent noise occurred midway through my attempt to attribute it to a limb scraping the walls. This instance featured a gradual swell and dip, the sort produced by floorboards yielding under a transfer of body weight. Drawn toward the base of the stairs, not from bravery, but because inaction amplified the dread, I ascended part way. The upper level's air hung chillier, as if the stove's heat struggled to ascend. Pausing to listen, I sought regularity in the disturbances. There was none. It seemed as though the presence above stirred solely when my proximity allowed detection. I recall clutching the banister, sensing the cabin somehow fixated on me in an unnatural manner that no structure should. In the end, I hauled one of the bulkier chairs over to block the stairs, mostly for that false sense of security rather than any real usefulness. The gale raging outdoors showed no signs of easing, and gusts rattled the panes relentlessly, leaving the entire place unsettled. My mind kept replaying those tracks looping around the exterior, how they veered off into the woods and vanished without a trace. The person responsible hadn't simply approached, glanced through a window, and departed. They'd examined the site thoroughly, orbited it, perhaps lingered in wait. I inspected both entrances repeatedly, 3 times each, pressing hard until the door frames flexed under the pressure. With every inspection, the quiet moments amid the faint creaks from above grew more piercing. The sort of hush that demands you leave it unbroken. Sometime past 1 a.m., as indicated by the faint light from the oven timer, a thud echoed right overhead. It wasn't forceful, merely assured, as if an item had fallen and tumbled a bit before coming to rest. A surge of adrenaline coursed through me, prompting me to seize the closest hefty item, an iron fire tool from beside the hearth. It offered scant protection, yet gripping it eased my vulnerability somewhat. I positioned myself under the secured door, straining to hear until my ears buzzed. No respiration, no scuffling, only the tempest and my racing pulse thundering in my chest. I realized I couldn't just linger in anticipation of the next sound. I needed to uncover what lay beyond that barrier, even if it required dismantling the whole setup. The modest toolkit stored beneath the sink held a standard screwdriver and a compact mallet, sufficient for teasing the pins free. Ascending the steps again was like entering a chillier realm, the air turning brisk as a subtle caution. I crouched by the panel, wedged the tool into the upper pivot, and began easing it out. Each strike of the mallet reverberated through the corridor, amplifying far beyond its actual volume. After several minutes of effort, I halted to dab the sweat from my brow. In that brief pause, a new noise seeped from the far side, not a groan or impact, but a gentle sigh, even and deliberate, as if matching the rhythm of the howling winds. That subdued breath pinned me motionless. It lacked any surprise or fear. It seemed calculated. From someone aware of my presence and equally attentive on their end. I laid my hand softly on the surface, hoping to detect any shift, yet it remained utterly immobile. The weather outside intensified, gales hauling powdery drifts over the shingles in prolonged rasps. I pondered fleeing to the ground floor, fortifying the den until dawn. Yet abandoning that threshold felt more terrifying than confronting the unknown within. Composing myself, I resumed on the joint, hammering until it yielded with a dull crack. The bottom one came undone quicker. Once both were sufficiently detached, I rose and prepared to yank the slab away. As I pulled, it budged just an inch before halting sharply, blocked by a substantial force from the interior. Not something solid like a piece of furniture, more yielding, pliable. I stiffened there, hands hooked on the rim, questioning if the obstruction was a figment. Then it countered, a gradual, intentional shove that sealed the opening once more. All my survival urges yelled to bolt, but my limbs wouldn't obey. The pressure didn't persist. Whatever entity had reacted chose not to force its way out, merely affirming its existence. I retreated from the surround, gaze fixed on the now tilted panel dangling askew from its unstable mounts. The corridor's atmosphere had chilled beyond the staircases, as if an essence had leaked through the gaps. Descending was a tentative, unsteady withdrawal. I avoided looking away from the upper platform until my feet hit solid ground. Even so, an eerie pull tugged at me, as though the upper level beckoned my return. I repositioned the sturdy seat, jamming it against the handle for an improvised blockade. Rest was out of the question, so I perched near the heater with the implement at hand, observing the subtle shimmer dance across the planks. Occasionally, the dwelling sighed or blasts hurled flakes at the glass, and I braced for ensuing steps each time. The night wore on without further disturbance from above. Yet the quiet offered no comfort. It hung expectant, like the building held its breath, anticipating my next move. I repeatedly eyed the shadowed ascent, anticipating a silhouette at the summit. As daybreak neared, the tempest waned at last, blanketing the landscape in new powder. Without hesitation, I snatched up my luggage, loaded it all into the pickup, and left the motor running as I gave the interior one final glance from the threshold. The upper level stayed silent, that warped entrance undisturbed. I moved out onto the veranda, eager to escape the ordeal entirely, only to spot something that froze me in place, fresh tracks veering off from the dwelling, plunging directly into the dense woods at the rear. These impressions were pronounced, sharper than the previous day's marks, and spaced out as though their maker had strolled leisurely amid the tempest. No signs of return loops, no incoming paths from elsewhere, just a direct trail vanishing into the woodland, suggesting my unseen companion had chosen to depart with the dawn. I sped off without a backward glance. Blizzards had never fazed me before, especially during those overnight work hours when I navigated all sorts of foul weather. But that afternoon, the heavens morphed into a roiling barrier of white that seemed surreal, as if a massive globe of flakes had been vigorously agitated without end. I'd just departed a modest business park on the town's outskirts, substituting for a colleague, and gusts whipped fiercely, slamming my SUV's flank and causing it to rock. Upon hitting the primary route, the signals ahead blurred in the eddying powder. The view worsened abruptly, as though everything past the glass had evaporated, trapping me in an eerie, insulated cocoon of powdery hush. I decided the best move was to duck into the nearest shelter, which turned out to be a retail plaza I knew from prior visits. Spacious area, straightforward layout, typically deserted in such gales. As soon as I entered, it was like entering emptiness. The lot's lamps glowed, yet the blizzard devoured their radiance before it hit the pavement. I maneuvered to a central bay, activated my flashers, and allowed the motor to purr so the warmth persisted. Powder built swiftly atop the grill, crystals streaking laterally in elongated trails, yanked by invisible tethers. Parked there, I assured myself the worst would soon lift, that I'd linger perhaps a quarter hour, possibly ring my sibling to pass the moments. Yet the stillness felt off, oppressively dense, an unnatural quiet birthed by the gale that amplified every interior noise unnaturally. I wiped a section of the glass to peer out, hoping the highway's shape might clarify from this vantage. Shortly after, beams flickered into view astern, hazy initially amid the dense veil. They sharpened, sweeping languid beams over the mounds, before a black four-door eased into the space. Initially, it registered as nothing unusual, likely another soul hunkering down like me. But the vehicle didn't settle conventionally. It crept up behind and halted askew, flooding my mirror with its glare. The intensity bore into me even when averted. It wasn't brushing my rear, but positioned so escape in reverse was impossible. I anticipated the operator would reposition into one of the myriad vacant slots nearby. Instead, the auto lingered, its rumble constant, beams piercing the flurry unhindered. After that interval, a chill of discomfort crept over me. I dismissed it as paranoia. Perhaps the motorist struggled with sightlines for parking or awaited a contact inside. I switched to forward gear, intending to relocate for some distance. As I advanced, the powder beneath crunched distinctly under the rubber, demanding precise guidance to avoid skidding. I curved around the adjacent aisle and selected a berth at the remote edge, adjacent to a line of barren hedges. Peering rearward, I braced for mere chaos of flakes. To my shock, the four-door was navigating the bend, tracing my route with a measured, purposeful crawl that prickled my skin. It showed no slippage whatsoever, unlike my ride, which teetered on ice. I reasoned they might share my goal, seeking respite from the battering winds. But as I veered into fresh rows, orienting toward the cleared medial path, the four-door mirrored flawlessly, trailing with a rhythmic glide that screamed purpose. The accumulation was so heavy, my fronts illuminated each particle in wild frenzy. Still, their lights sliced the maelstrom effortlessly. I inched ahead once more, and my wheels faltered slightly, jolting the wheel. That other vehicle, however, glided forward with an eerie accuracy. No skidding, no second-guessing, like the icy layer coating the ground didn't faze it at all. I veered into a different lane suddenly, aiming to lose whatever was tailing me, yet the sedan matched my maneuver with a deliberate, unhurried steadiness that left my throat parched. Fighting back the rising dread, I circled the parking area toward the way out. But now the snow pelted down in thick curtains, obliterating any view of the road ahead. Gusts screamed over the pavement, whipping up fine flakes into twisting forms that flitted among the lampposts like elusive phantoms. I realized venturing onto the street without visibility would be reckless, so I paused, easing ahead slightly to check the tires' hold. The sedan inched closer from the rear once more. Not near enough for contact, yet positioned so insistently that I couldn't dismiss its presence. It exerted a subtle, relentless pressure that seemed predatory rather than mere pursuit. I retreated from the exit, seeking a clearer path, and the sedan pulled back in sync, mirroring my every shift flawlessly. That seamless synchronization sent a chill through my frame, knotting my muscles in apprehension. I swerved sharply into yet another row, this time gunning the engine more aggressively, allowing the rear to fishtail before I regained control. The sedan trailed with that same tortuously languid pace, unflinching against the slick surface, never accelerating or faltering. The gap between us remained constant, as if the driver tracked it with some hidden precision. Venturing further into the lot meant encountering less cleared paths, and before long my wheels were plowing through fresh drifts, piling nearly to the grille's midpoint. Blasts of air hurled the powdery buildup into coiling surges, my beams illuminating the vague contours of hidden curbs under accumulating heaps. Each maneuver drew me into what felt like a labyrinth mastered by another far more adeptly. And the sedan pressed on, methodical and purposeful. The instant it dawned on me that the driver wasn't simply shadowing me, but guiding me toward some destination struck like a blow. Whenever I attempted to swing back to the lot's central cleared zones, the sedan would adjust minutely, blocking just enough to herd me toward the perimeter, where the snowbanks loomed deepest and untouched by salt or plows. My tires started bogging down in the yielding powder, traction vanishing faster. The SUV strained visibly, the motor emitting a deep, protesting rumble as the wheels spun futilely and slid. The sedan, by contrast, sustained its smooth, disquieting flow, steering clear of the worst accumulations, steadily forcing me away from the illuminated, secure core of the space. No other vehicles dotted the area, no figures stirred in the distance, just the blizzard and that ominous form at my back, exploiting the white veil as cover for whatever scheme brewed inside. I yanked the steering wheel fiercely and attempted to slice across a pair of aisles simultaneously, banking on speed to propel me toward the maintained stretch. But the drifts clung like sticky sludge. The vehicle bucked, then veered broadside, forcing me to delicately throttle the gas to prevent it from being engulfed. Peering through the frosted rear glass, the sedan reappeared unhurriedly, holding its calculated rhythm as though the tempest held no sway over it. Glows from the nearby plaza diffused weak auras over the landscape, but the sedan's profile swallowed them, resolving into a squat, unwavering silhouette that betrayed no weakness. Each correction I made prompted its subtle realignment, boxing me in incrementally. The realization that this pursuit was calculated, backed by composure and intent, weighed oppressively on me. I blared the horn, praying the blast would pierce the gale and summon a glance from within the shuttered shops. Yet the roar vanished into the tumult without a trace. I scanned the lineup of structures, anticipating some stir, a silhouette darting out or a portal swinging wide. but the landscape stayed frozen, devoid of any human trace. Switching to reverse, I maneuvered to evade the lot's most buried section, the rubber grinding harshly before gaining purchase. The moment I retreated, the sedan swept laterally in a sweeping curve, sealing the sole accessible route free of heavy cover. It advanced without haste or spasm, slotting into position with flawless command. It was as if the operator anticipated my every struggle against the onslaught and their own immunity to it. Anger fused with terror, and I stomped the pedal too forcefully. The SUV surged ahead, jolting as the nose mounted a ridge of compacted white. I targeted a slim gap, flanked by towering walls of snow, figuring the sedan wouldn't dare wedge there. Sidelong winds battered the flank, and briefly, the vista dissolved into frantic white lashes across the glass. Once the snowfall eased just enough to expose the parking lot once more. That sedan was already shifting position, turning deliberately as though it knew exactly where I'd head next. Its beams cut steadily through the snowbanks, holding firm without a hint of falter. I kept waiting for some sign of trouble, a slide, a lurch, anything showing the driver was battling the same brutal weather as me. Yet the car glided with eerie ease, defying the conditions like it operated under different laws, exuding a calm assurance amid the chaos. As I approached the tight passage, the drifts loomed taller than I'd thought, climbing almost to the bumper's height. I realized pushing ahead could ground the SUV, leaving me hopelessly trapped with no escape. The sedan inched nearer, not accelerating but steadily eroding the slim margin I'd clung to. Inside my vehicle, the atmosphere grew oppressive, weighing down like the blizzard's relentless pressure from beyond the glass. I scanned desperately for a gap, a dip in the mounds, a smoother route, any possibility. But the sedan maneuvered to block them all. It had stopped pursuing outright. Now it was encircling, aligning precisely, sealing off my world with measured precision. What chilled me most wasn't the gale or the solitude. It was the dawning truth that the person behind the wheel had singled me out on purpose and wasn't pausing for the weather to clear. They were biding time until my options vanished entirely. I quit dodging the sedan and concentrated on maintaining the engine's hum. Gusts hammered the SUV, rattling the panes while flakes accumulated against the sides as if intent on entombing me right there. The sedan drew in until its lights flooded the rear view, casting a ghostly pallor over everything inside. The driver's form registered only as a shadowy figure, rigidly motionless. No signals, no efforts to signal. Just that steady presence peering from afar. My heart pounded wildly as it hit me. The tempest had handed them the perfect setup. An abandoned expanse, utter obscurity, and one lone figure with no safe way out. I clenched the wheel harder, forcing my breaths to even out, aware that hysteria would only fog any slim shot at survival I might have left. The notion struck abruptly, wild, frantic, yet my sole glimmer of potential salvation. If I backed directly at the sedan, not aiming to collide but to compel it to reposition, perhaps I'd carve out sufficient room to pivot and return to the cleared stretch. It seemed foolhardy, but so was remaining frozen. I dropped into reverse and punched the accelerator lightly. The tires whirred, gripped, and the SUV eased rearward a short distance before the sedan responded. It eased away fluidly, still avoiding any wild swerve, but that retreat created a narrow breach, just wide enough for my rig. I slammed into forward gear and cranked the steering sharply. The rubber protested as it churned through the powder. The nose veered off, then realigned as the vehicle surged toward the lot's heart. I avoided glancing back. The flurry had intensified, draping a opaque veil pierced solely by dim outlines of streetlights. I targeted the slightest band of shadowed asphalt, the lone route appearing somewhat passable. The SUV jolted over lumpy terrain, then leveled as the wheels bit into firmer ground. I advanced gradually, braced for beams to pierce the haze at my tail. But no radiance followed. Even upon hitting the shoveled zone, visibility stretched no farther than 20 feet with eddies of white devouring the rest. Still, I seized the moment, guiding toward the outlet and easing onto the highway. The blasts were savage, but the surface below offered more stability than the lot's morass. Hitting the primary thoroughfare, I pressed on until my fingers throbbed from the vice-like hold on the controls. I crawled along the shoulder, alert for any trace of that sedan. Yet none pierced the turmoil. No lights flickered in the reflections. Only when I spotted a service station aglow enough to pierce the murk did I veer in, tucking beneath the shelter. I lingered until the squall subsided, well after the warmth had thawed my jacket and dissolved the slush from my footwear. The space behind stayed empty. No other vehicles arrived. To this day, I can't say whether the sedan lingered in that mall's confines or slipped away the instant I escaped, but its methodical advance, its hushed encirclement, and the way the blizzard seemed more like a deliberate shroud for some inscrutable intent, that's etched indelibly. Raised in a tight-knit rural spot where blizzards ground life to a halt, serene evenings were routine for me. That season at 17, I found myself housebound as the paths morphed into impassable snowy channels by early evening. My mother was pulling an all-night shift at a medical center a couple of towns over, while my big brother had gone out of town to hang out with buddies, leaving me alone in the house. I'd figured on just hunkering down through the bad weather, popping in some films, and warming up some old takeout. That was the extent of my plans. Nothing fancy. Gusts of wind battered the outer walls in prolonged, irregular waves that gave the entire building an ancient, worn-out vibe. I kept glancing at my weather app roughly once an hour, more from routine than anything, as the notifications stacked up like alerts I figured weren't worth worrying about. For much of the night, the blizzard seemed like the main hassle on my plate. The raps on the door began once darkness had fallen amid a veil of falling snow. They weren't light knocks or anything you could pin on a stray limb from a tree. Instead, they arrived as steady, deliberate thuds, spaced just right so everyone registered clearly. Initially, I wondered if a nearby resident might be in trouble, though folks around here never venture out in a snowstorm like ours unless it's a real crisis. When I glanced out the narrow pane beside the entrance, I spotted a guy on the front steps in a delivery uniform, vivid red with a glowing band over the torso, the sort that stands out even in lousy conditions. In his grip was a carry-out sack that drooped unevenly, as if its contents had slid around during the journey. He showed no signs of the chill, despite the gale whipping right into him. Spotting me through the drapes, he hoisted the bag slightly and cocked his head, expectant. He shouted that he carried a rush delivery tied to an order from this very spot. His words cut through the howling storm with surprising clarity, almost as if the breeze funneled them straight to my ear. I shouted back that I hadn't placed any order and pointed out that no eateries were making runs with all the streets blocked off. He offered no pushback. Instead, he simply noted that the request originated right from within my home, sounding like he'd memorized the phrase from someone else's script. His posture clashed entirely with the freezing temps. He held his frame loose, one fist tucked casually in a pocket, as if he were idling at a shelter rather than wading through drifts up to his knees. That eerie composure amid such savage weather thickened the atmosphere inside like a weight settling in. I repeated through the barrier that he'd come to the wrong house. He stayed rooted. He stayed silent. He merely eased the sack downward, as though gauging how I'd react. Then he descended the steps. Briefly, I assumed he was departing, but rather than retreating along the path, he swung toward the house's flank. His footwear sank firmly into the pristine powder, carving crisp tracks that the breeze hadn't yet blurred. The crunch of his approach grew nearer to the lounge panes, and the outline of his coat skimmed by the curtain's fringe. No more pounding came. He simply patrolled the perimeter, halting by each opening as if scouting for vulnerabilities. I switched off all the lamps within arm's reach, figuring the blackness might deter him, yet the rhythm of his footfalls persisted, shifting from one wall to the next. Once, a gentle prod sounded against the galley glass. Not strong enough for damage, but intentional enough to pinpoint the source without question. The tempest raging beyond seemed tame compared to the figure prowling my property. For what felt like ages, nothing broke the assault of the winds slamming the structure except the subtle drag of his soles adjusting spots. I huddled low by the corridor, positioned to glimpse sections of the interior without exposing myself to any view. My cell kept dropping bars, turning every try to reach my mom or the local dispatch into a stalled display or a severed link. The blackout rendered the space eerily still amid the blasts, a hush where the tiniest sound sharpened into awareness. Eventually, the pacing halted altogether, leading me to believe he'd moved on. I held out a solid 10 minutes before edging toward the den's overlook. That's when a silhouette appeared by the remote edge of the veranda, motionless like carved stone. His features blurred in the gloom, but the luminescent strip on his attire snagged a sliver of glow from the lights next door's backup power, confirming his lingering presence. As the gale raged fiercer, his refusal to quit grew even more bizarre. No sensible courier or rational person would linger outdoors in such ferocity without a dire reason. Periodically, he'd probe yet another pane. Nothing aggressive, merely these faint systematic prods or a quick shake of the sash. It came across as him examining the building itself, less than seeking notice. My hand clenched the molding until sensation fled my digits, straining to hear beyond my own ragged breaths. I avoided relocating to a different space. Any motion like that might invite more from him. As the prods arrived at the eating area's glass, a murmur escaped him, too muffled to catch, as if he were reciting notes under his breath. In the end, I somehow fired off a quick message to the sheriff's department. Just my location and word that an intruder was attempting to break in. No reply came to confirm it went through, but it was my sole idea in the moment. Shortly afterward, the noises shifted beyond my door. The light knocks and steps gave way to a scraping drag against the exterior wall, reminiscent of the delivery bag rubbing on the house siding. As it neared the rear entrance, a firm push rattled the metal in its frame. That barrier was built solid, yet even the slight give sent a sharp squeeze through my core, a sensation etched in my mind. I huddled there, legs drawn up, eyes fixed on the shifting shadows playing over the kitchen tiles with each gust. The thing that unnerved me deepest was his apparent calm. No yells, no pounding, no signs of irritation at the silence inside. It was as if he was content to bide his time indefinitely. Fresh snow erased his prior trails steadily, but each lap around the grounds left a fresh gouge in the drifts. I quit tracking him and simply endured, praying aid was truly coming. What seemed an eternity later, a low engine growl echoed from afar, deliberate and weighty, unlike any standard vehicle. That rumble halted him. The abrupt quiet near the kitchen pane gave it away. For the first time that evening, he withdrew, edging toward the property's boundary. I held still until the motor's roar vibrated the planks beneath me. A pair of officers arrived in a snow-rigged patrol vehicle, their beams slicing wide, ghostly beams through the yard. Upon stepping out, the figure in the courier's coat didn't bolt immediately. He hovered by the woods, seeming to deliberate, the food container dangling slack from his grip. A deputy hailed him, but rather than respond, he pivoted and melted into the swirling flurries, vanishing like the gale had claimed him. Pursuit wasn't feasible. The whiteout was impenetrable. Their priority was the dwelling and ensuring my safety. Admitting them brought a fierce chill surging in, surreal after the long confinement in that hushed, shadowed space. While I lingered in the foyer, they patrolled the edges, their beams probing the drifts. Most prior marks were smothered by the weather, though some pronounced indents revealed his repeated orbits. They spotted additional traces, too, ones approaching panes I hadn't considered, like the overlooked basement vent. The outfit raised red flags right off, since local eateries had closed hours before the paths turned treacherous. One inquired if he'd offered identification or cited some error, yet his sole assertion was an urgent order from within. Relaying those words aloud twisted them into something even odder than his original delivery. They remained until the gale subsided sufficiently for radio verification of similar alerts. It turned out a guy in assorted courier gear, varied hues, varied labels, had neared multiple residences that evening. In certain instances, residents caught him testing knobs or gliding objects past the glass. No one had admitted him, largely as no one anticipated meals amid the tempest. The officer figured he was zeroing in on empty drives or dimmed homes, betting on fear to draw someone out. Realizing I wasn't his lone focus, elevated the ordeal beyond mere chance, suggesting a deliberate trek via the foul weather. Dawn brought a hushed blanket of powder, rendering the outdoors pristine and serene, as though the events never transpired. Yet the vehicle's ruts and ghostly boot scars served as stark proof. The department never nabbed him, as far as I know. Regardless, post-incident, my mother upgraded all the hardware, installed sensor floods, and insisted on the landline staying active. The officers affirmed my choice to stay barricaded was wise, given the mimicry of various services. To this day, with each frosty squall, I find myself peering out the panes excessively, attuned to echoes I'd rather never encounter anew. No repeat has occurred, but that image of him methodically prowling our perimeter lingers, destined to haunt me forever.